Good morning and welcome to this session, Career Jumpers, and an session as part of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. I'm Finn Williams and I'm the co-founder and chief executive of Public Practice. Really pleased to be joined here by three of Public Practice friends and family who I'll introduce shortly. This session is a session where we're going to ask, how is the job description of the public servant changing? What kind of skills and experience will the public sector need in the future? And how can we rebuild the public sector's capacity for innovation and creativity? So, as I said, I'm being joined here by Zahra Haider, who's Regeneration and Development Architectural Officer at Enfield Council. And she's also a public practice associate there. Zahra joined Enfield in April as they scale up their role, directly building new council housing and taking the lead on master planning huge new areas of their borough. She's already led on an ideas competition for intergenerational living, working with BAME-led and local and architectural practices. Zahra is also the founder of the not-for-profit Our Girls Mentoring, working with young students from marginalised backgrounds to encourage diversity in various professions. Also joined by Megan Charnley. Megan is also a public practice associate and senior regeneration manager at London Borough of Newham, where she's working on their really exciting community wealth building agenda under Mayor Roxana Fiaz. She's also a director and co-founder of Projects Office, which is a multidisciplinary architecture practice based in London, and currently splits her time between the two of these roles. And we will be joined by Paul Frainer, Assistant Director for Strategy and Economy at South Cambridgeshire District Council. Paul has, in my opinion, one of the keenest minds in local government and brings a cross-cutting lateral approach to all kinds of areas, including sustainable economic development, strategic planning and policy, partnerships, place shaping, regeneration and transformation. And Paul has actually hosted 4 public practice placements in his department. So I should start by explaining that my background is in architecture, but I'm not actually an architect. And in fact, then I went on to work for planning departments in London, but I'm not a planner. And if people ask me what I do, I often say I'm a bureaucrat. So I'm really pleased to be speaking at this festival because I really care passionately about reclaiming the idea of bureaucracy as something to be proud of. If you go back 50 years, around half of all architects in the UK worked in the public sector, worked for all of us. Public service was, at that time, really seen as a privilege. But by the time I made the decision to join Croydon Council back in 2008, it had come to be seen as a bit of a last resort. By 2016, less than 1% of architects were left in the public sector. Of course, this is only one discipline, but it stands for a wider paradigm shift in the status of local government, and in particular the public planner over the last 40 years. This wasn't just the result of legislative changes and the withdrawal of funding, it was also the result of a kind of cultural campaign against public planning, led in some cases from the very top of government, from Michael Heseltine's accusation in 1979 that planners are keeping jobs locked up in filing cabinets, to David Cameron claiming in 2011 to be taking on the enemies of enterprise, the town hall officials who take forever with those planning decisions that can be make or break for a business, all the way through to Boris Johnson saying only 3 months ago that time is money, and the newt counting delays in our system, referring to planning, are a massive drag on the productivity and prosperity of our country. And over that time, planners have gone from being seen as kind of public servants to public enemies in some way. And the situation, of course, has only been exacerbated by a decade of austerity, which has seen net public sector investment in planning almost half in the UK, from 2 billion in 2011 to just over 1 billion in 2018. Unsurprisingly, this has led to a growing skills gap between the public and private sectors, to the extent that where authorities have the funding, they're finding planners harder to recruit than any other profession. And just at the time when public planning arguably has reached its lowest point, we've realised we need it more than ever to help recover from a major public health crisis and its impact on local economies, to rebalance housing inequalities that have been brutally exposed by the pandemic, to deconstruct the spatial inequalities that we can see all around us in our cities, and to take meaningful local action on the climate emergency. These are complex structural challenges that no one product, contract, or company can tackle on their own. They demand coordinated, cross-disciplinary, place-based, long-term approaches, and that's something that I think local government is uniquely placed to lead on. We call this proactive planning, and that's why we set up public practice in 2017 to build the public sector's capacity for proactive planning. So I'm going to briefly explain what public practice is and how it works before opening up for a discussion with our panelists. So the model of public practice is that we recruit what we call associates, all kinds of built environment experts at all stages of their career, in 6 monthly recruitment rounds to join cohorts. And we match those associates with authorities to express an interest in hosting a placement. Associates are placed within those authorities for a minimum of 12 months. And for 10% of that time, they take part in an R&D program run by public practice. The authorities pay public practice a placement fee, which is around half the price of going out to a private agency, and they pay the salaries of associates. And that's made affordable by a group of supporters who provide public practice with grant funding that cross-subsidises the programme and helps them to invest strategically in building capacity in the public sector. When I say associates, I mean all kinds of disciplines across the built environment, architects, but also ecologists, regeneration experts, infrastructures and civil engineers, through to surveyors and data and digital experts. And when we say authorities, we mean all kinds of public sector authorities, from London boroughs to also even hospitals and city government, as well as potentially national government. Partners, we have a mix of public, private and third sector partners, including the Mayor of London. So far we've run 4 cohorts in 3 years. We've had over 1,500 people apply to the programme. And over 90% of people are applying from outside the public sector. And within those 4 cohorts, we've placed 123 associates across 42 different authorities all around London and the wider southeast so far. And they're doing all kinds of work, from strengthening local economies to coordinating infrastructure to raising design quality to empowering communities. That adds up to over 25,000 days of resources placed into local authorities. And why I think that's significant is that 92% of the placements so far are brand new roles. These are roles that simply wouldn't have existed or been done otherwise. And critically, when you go to the end of that 12-month placement period, nearly 90% of associates have chosen to continue working within the public sector. And that's really important for us in terms of building the public sector's long-term capacity for proactive planning. I said 10% of each placement is dedicated to a program of collective research and development, and we really see this as a kind of shared R&D platform across local government. And that's really focused on developing practical outputs for better public planning. So written up as resources that are hosted on our website, and backed up by working toolkits, templates and guidance. The really kind of addressing the really everyday challenges that public servants face through useful, practical resources that authorities can adopt, adapt and share. So I think what impact is this having? Well, we haven't been going a huge amount of time so far. We do think it is starting to build, and we can see it starting to build in-house capacity for creative thinking, for innovation across local government. We're slowly, subtly, I think, rewriting the job description of the public planner, one placement at a time, expanding the agency of what it is to work within local government. And we're beginning to transform perceptions of public service. And of course, all of this with the scale of the programme is a drop in the ocean of the change that's needed across public planning, across the UK and beyond. But it does feel like it's part of a bigger paradigm shift in a different direction. And of course, this festival is part of that. From seeing public planning and public services being about locking up jobs in filing cabinets to community wealth building, from seeing planners as the enemies of enterprise to thinking about the entrepreneurial state, from new counting to new municipalism. So to unpack all of that and to answer both my questions and your questions, please do drop them in the chat. I'm now going to pass over to Megan, Zahra, and Paul, and stop sharing my screen as well so everyone can see each other. I will start by asking, I think we're still yet to be joined by Paul actually, start by asking Megan about the kind of the wider mission, I suppose, the purpose for public planning right now, as we are, of course, grappling with the local precedents of unprecedented global changes, in particularly with the pandemic. And I wanted to ask what kind of skills you see being useful. You're working in Newham, one of the local authorities that's been hardest hit by the coronavirus of all of the authorities in the UK. What kind of skills you see being useful in the public sector in your role, and what kind of new skills does the public sector need to bring in?
Well, I should say that I'm in the regeneration team rather than the planning team, so I'll speak from that perspective. And I think the main thing that has struck me is not that there's a lack of skills in the local authority, but rather that there's a lack of conversation and sort of working across silos to solve problems. And I think that actually the COVID crisis was a real catalyst to making some of that change happen. People were actually starting to work outside of their remits very quickly, actually reacting very quickly to solve problems which were really imminent and needed solving quickly. So I think that has been a sort of a major shift in how the local authority feels like, individuals in the local authority feels like they can respond. There was some within my small team, there's just 6 of us in my particular sort of focus team. And the couple of people were asked to step forward and do completely different projects beyond the projects that they were currently working on. And some people felt there was this resistance to that, and other people were just really keen to get stuck in. So I think that was a sort of slight shift in mindset as to how flexible people could be. And I think that's very different from my experience working in the private sector, which is that you just jump wherever you need to jump quickly in order to solve problems. And I think that we saw some of that happening, and I feel like that is a change that's really going to stick. Yeah, definitely. In a weird situation, because you can't just walk over to someone's desk anymore and talk to them, but you can somehow sort of make those changes happen and those conversations started. And I think that's a really important shift.
And Zahra, you started your role at Enfield right in the midst of lockdown. How does it feel like the pandemic in particular has not only defined the way you work within the authority, but also the kind of purpose and mission behind your colleagues and officers in Enfield?
I mean, I was really, like Megan was saying, really impressed. I started just at the end of March, and it was incredible to see how the local authority came together to respond to the coronavirus. I mean, it really was an impressive task force across the council. And so as soon as I started, we were getting involved with making calls, people were getting involved with different projects. And I hadn't quite realised at that point how much a local authority is actually involved in doing, looking after the community, really. And it was very much of a no family gets left behind. And so for me, that was incredibly impressive to see, and one of the reasons I was really keen to join the public sector. So it was just starting on that was incredibly impressive. And then from there on, I think it's almost everyone's been so adaptable to the virtual environment, and that's almost created these opportunities to have conversations across the board. So I mean, my experience of that so far has been really positive. And you know, things like the competition came about very much as a kind of top-down ambition to let's try and work locally, let's try and invest locally, because people recognize there are difficulties that small businesses were facing during coronavirus, and that sort of steamrolled into, you know, in responding into recent political undercurrents with the Black Lives Matter movement. So it's really, in the short space I've been there, it's been incredibly agile and responding to two very big changes.
While you're talking about that competition, it'd be great if you could explain it a bit more, you know, the aims of that competition and how different it is from an approach to traditional procurement that council might have taken, because I think it speaks to that level of agility and responsiveness and connection with communities that councils have kind of been forced to rediscover over the last few months.
Yeah, so I mean, this is an ideas competition, and the idea really came from well, top down initially, as let's try and host an ideas competition to explore intergenerational housing. Enfield was delivering a lot of housing across the borough, so they were quite, you know, coming down from seniors in housing. It was an idea that let's explore different alternative typology. We've got a lot of large families in Enfield, lots of people from different communities where living with your family is quite commonplace. So let's try and address that. And at the same time, let's try and invest, well, host out an opportunity for local architects and small architects to get involved, to keep, well, essentially just to help sustain their business for a few months. And as that competition, I mean, it started just before I got involved with two previous associates. And because there was a sort of will that this is an opportunity to do something different, this is an opportunity to do something which really engages with local people and engages with diverse communities, and the Black Lives Matter movement was happening at the same time. It was a very, very quick response to let's try and address some of the challenges that we see happening within the architectural industry, barriers that I think many of us as architects have faced with working within small practices, working with diverse practices. So being able to take that experience and then really quickly say, actually, let's try and host this competition as something a bit more ethical. So, you know, refunding, recompensing any applicant that takes part or contributes ideas, being able to talk about intellectual property, being able to talk about all these like finer details that I think we often struggle with in practice. And then, you know, because I think the will was there that this is something we're responding to in coronavirus and Black Lives Matter, it was just incredible to see it all come together and say, let's just do this. And there was no real resistance. Everyone was on board with it. Everyone kind of recognized what we were saying. And really that thing you were talking about, Finn, the bureaucracy, it's almost all the sign-offs and all the different people we had to speak to added to the process and made it so much more richer. So it wasn't really a cumbersome thing to get all these sign-offs. It was something that everyone was like, well, actually I'm doing this project, and or in my role I also am overseeing these other projects, this is how it could get involved. And so it became much more richer than what it had started off to be, and I think a lot of that happened in a very short space of time. So it's a very agile thing, and yeah, I mean, incredible to work on.
Yeah, wow, thanks, Zahra. And Megan, it'd be good to hear a bit about how the last few months have changed the focus of your role as well, and you know what that shift towards a more agile approach really means on the ground in Newham and the Royal Dock.
Yeah, so Newham has adopted a community wealth building agenda that's been in place probably, I think, since I joined, or relatively recently before that. So I joined in last October. And that has been all about investing in local services to reinvigorate the local economy. And that's Mayor Roxana Fiaz has been pretty, what's the word? I don't know, pretty radical, I think, in establishing that. Also declaring a climate emergency. So within the first 2 years of her administration, there was quite a radical shift to what the council was focusing on. My project specifically is to look at two areas just north and south of the Royal Docks in London. The docks are a historic port for London. They were being used as a working dock until 1981, at which point the docks closed, and that had a major economic impact in the area as well as sort of in the whole of East London. The two areas that I'm looking at are really interesting because they're just north and south of the docks, and they are two very different communities. One is where lots of the dock workforce used to live. So there's quite a lot of terraced housing, Victorian housing, but also some 1960s high rises. And just north of it is this another community, which is all sort of residential 1980s development, so really different, but both of them have suffered from a lack of investment over the last 30 years, and as a result there's very little in terms of community infrastructure, although there is a strong sense of community. So my role was to look at those areas and try to understand where the gaps of provision existed, and to make sure that they benefited from the quite dramatic changes which the docks are going to see over the next few years. The docks have been designated an enterprise zone, which means that there's a lot of businesses which will be established there. There are tax advantages to setting up there, and so before coronavirus, there's a very big move, a lot of massive developments happening, although they have slowed down somewhat. But so my role anyway was to look at those local communities, and what I had been doing was to combine that with the community wealth building agenda, and also looking at the climate emergency and trying to use those as drivers to help communities build resilience and capacity, and to start to sort of drive their own economic regeneration. So I was already sort of doing that before coronavirus, and the impact of the pandemic has been just to really double down on that and to think even more locally. So trying to understand where the council has assets which can be used by the local community, to try and knit together networks of enterprises and institutions. There's a university right on the docks, so that's a really great place to start, but start to try to weave together those networks to create opportunities essentially, and to start with those are very simple opportunities, sort of trying to also identify loops where value can be generated. So trying to create very simple opportunities, but with a longer term view, which ties into a shift in moving to a green economy, which is part of the council's response to coronavirus, is to move forward to try and capture the potential of moving to green innovation. So yeah, my role, although it hasn't really dramatically shifted, because I was sort of already trying to deliver on those outcomes, but I guess with the pandemic has been a sort of focus on focusing even more locally, and really understanding the immediate issues, immediate challenges, but also keeping in mind that longer term view of where are we going and how do we make sure that this is the first step to getting there.
And thank you. And Zahra mentioned her experience of bureaucracy, so to speak, the processes and systems and kind of governance frameworks, I suppose, you work within the public sector. As someone who's moved relatively recently from working from in the private sector to working in local government, how far is those stereotypes of the public sector or local government as being slow and bureaucratic been reflected in your own experiences of working at Newham?
Well, I think I joined Newham with two other associates, and I think all of us had the same sinking feeling when we first logged into the council computer system, of just like, oh my goodness, what have we done here? Because it was so clunky and slow compared to what we were used to. But of course, that's just the sort of administration system, I suppose. So I think things are slow in the public sector, but I also think everything is slow. Just generally, if we're talking about building projects are slow. And I think that the counterpoint to that criticism that things are slow is that the scale of opportunity in a local authority is so huge, that a decision that the council makes, that a local authority makes, has implications across every part of residents' lives. So although it may take time to make that decision, and the changes may take time to implement, the implications just really have sort of really dramatic ripple effects touching everyone's life. So, for example, if a council declares a climate emergency, which so many councils have now done in London, that's not just a sort of statement. Hopefully it should touch everything. It should touch how people's bins are collected. It should touch how they get to work, how they get to school, how their energy is provided, how their neighborhoods are developed and what their buildings look like, and what, even to the what's served in the canteen or for your school dinner. So a small change, that's a big change, but a small change can have a really dramatic implications on people's lives. So yeah, whether it's slow, I don't think it necessarily is more slow than private sector, but I also think that's not so bad. In fact, I would say that maybe things are too fast. I think that a 4-year administration isn't really long enough even to make some radical changes, especially when we're looking at the major challenges that communities are facing now. A 4-year administration, if you have to make decisions that are going to deliver within that, then you're talking about short-term wins instead of longer-term thinking. And I really think, for me, that's been a real sort of realization of just like, oh, hang on, we're quite limited because we can't think slowly enough. We have to think fast. So I think that's a sort of slightly different approach. But I also just we talked a few times about agility, and I just wanted to sort of touch on that because I worked for a few years in tech startups, and I really fell in love with the speed and agility of that way of working, of developing tech products, because it's how you work when you're at architecture school, that you sort of come up with ideas, you build prototypes, you iterate, you continuously improve. But actually in real world construction, it can be really hard to do that. And I know that at Projects Office, when we set up this architecture practice, we really wanted to bring that in and make sure that we did that. But in reality, it's quite tough. And we really have to carve out space and budget to do that. And in fact, it's been interesting reflecting on this, that the opportunity where we've had the best opportunity we've had to do that has been working with the NHS, where we have actually managed to prototype. So I think that's really interesting that working there, it's sort of as a private entity, but for a public service, we've actually had more space to do that. But obviously, the problem with that agility and with that prototyping is that you need to have freedom to fail. And when you're working in the public sector, you can't fail because, there's public funds. But I really think that, and you wouldn't want to fail like they do in the tech industry, because I kind of think that's mad, the way they celebrate failure. It's really weird. But I do think that we have to find space to test and innovate. And I think particularly when we're talking about addressing the climate emergency or responding to the COVID pandemic, that we don't have time to wait for the exemplar projects that can be held up as like, this is how you do it. We can't wait for the private sector to deliver those projects and then copy it. I really think that the public sector has to learn how to iterate and to sort of develop its own agile methodology, which is within safe parameters. So I think if we could find a way, and this is sort of what I'm trying to figure out a little bit, is if we can find a way that works with local communities in a very transparent way, but to set up sort of frameworks or ways of working which allow experimentation and which allow for small but fast failures. So I'm not talking about like huge projects that then are really risky, because obviously risk has got to be avoided, but small failures where we're working with the local communities to learn really publicly and to say, this is what we learned, this is the benefit that this came, and this is what we would do. I really think that we have a massive opportunity to do that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to briefly ask Zahra, put the same kind of questions to Zahra, because I know it's come up in the chat, about the level of resistance you've found to introducing new ways of working and new ways of thinking within local government, or your colleagues across the public practice network and cohorts, before then going to Paul, who's now been able to join us and bringing you into the conversation. So Zahra, have you found obstacles and barriers within the public sector way of working, and if so, how have you overcome them?
I definitely think there have been points where things have been a bit tricky, but that's more just, and I've had a very limited experience of it, largely working on small sites or this competition, where there's resistance, there's been dialogue, and that dialogue has been about working through things and explaining why we're wanting to do a certain thing a certain way. And sometimes that's been also about me learning back. I mean, almost I had this recent experience where we had an away day, and just being able to talk to other team members or officers that I was working with to understand where they're coming from. And so I think that's something that has been a learning curve, but less so, I guess, like in my very limited experience, what I've found is actually I've suggested something because this competition, I was often just suggesting things because I sort of felt like, oh, I'd faced this in practice. Why don't we try and do this? And actually there was a real appetite for that. And there was a real appetite for, okay, well, let's try it. Let's just see what happens. And then following the competition, there's been a real push for let's get feedback. Let's find out how we did. Let's try and develop lessons learned workshops so that we can really critically evaluate how we've done, because there were, of course, some failures. And let's try and build from that. So not necessarily seeing it as a negative thing to have done something wrong, but just being very open about it and saying, how can we learn? And I think we've also learned that from other councils who've come in to speak to us about their experiences with procurement, and, very hands up, well, we did this wrong, and here's how we can do it better. And so that, I think, is a significant shift for me that I didn't feel was there before, that it's not necessarily resistance, but that more when there's reasons why things might not happen that are based on other people's experience. And there's also reasons where I might do something maybe didn't quite work out, but that's all right. We learn from it. And it's not necessarily a sort of negative thing.
Thanks, Zahra. I think what's been already really interesting to hear is how our kind of assumptions about bureaucracy or innovation already starting to be expanded and challenged, I suppose, by the real experience of working within local government. So, Paul, the kind of formal idea of innovation has often been something that's happened to the public sector via external consultants, or happened on the fringes of the public sector via innovation labs and things like that. From your experience at South Cambridgeshire, also previously at Essex County Council, how can it become part of mainstream practice? How can that creativity be part of the way you work within an authority?
It's a really interesting kind of discussion, because I think that the public sector probably has quite a lot more innovation than is given credit for. It's just its ability to be able to scale that into something meaningful or share that across organisations. I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have. We tend to operate in quite a siloed way per authority, whereas industries tend to communicate with each other and learn from each other, whereas the public sector, or specifically local government, finds that difficult because of the politics, and that tends to be something that's problematic. In terms of my experience, I think that there seems to be movement now, certainly in some areas of councils, where innovation and just thinking differently is kind of just the norm. Specifically thinking around those councils who have progressed kind of, say, digital transformation. I'm more talking about service design really, and how we look at user-centric design, but it's still a very few local authorities. In our area and our world, in planning and placemaking, it's a very different problem, because it's quite a old part of local authorities: planning, placemaking, economic development, and often enough it's very highly politicized. So doing innovation is often, even by office, and actually you can have the greatest administration in terms of your political administration, or the most aspirational, but officers are often quite reticent, because that they are there is a perception, and there's a lot of noise around. Planning's is this hugely divisive piece. And I think I was listening to Megan talk as I just joined. Local authorities touch every part of everybody's life, and I would argue that is exactly the same as planning. It's a very dry subject, but it certainly does have huge impact on everything. But there is a huge amount of negativity around it, because of where we've been in the last however many years, because it gets used as a political kind of, batting brush. Administrations get in on the back of planning, so that's how it's used to to say the planning's not working, the placemaking is not, it's poor, we're not doing this right. And then, the next administration comes in. So there is this reticence. And I think innovation in that sector is, I've been racking my brain, as you know, Finn, for many, many years to try and work out how we just do a little bit of that iterative approach. Do we, how we take small projects and how we get that trust and to be able to do something just very slightly different. And I think, my experience of the first things that have really taken some sort of movement forward is around communications and engagement, because that's bought into by both officers, senior officers and politicians. Because if you start doing that right, yes, you put your head above the parapet and you get a lot of people who don't like what you're doing, but at the same time you get a bigger footprint of your communities actually having to have two-way dialogue with you. And that's one, I think to innovate in the engagement stuff, we are councils, okay, we're local authorities, we are supposed to be delivering services to citizens, as that's our job, yeah, but inherently we just tell them stuff, we don't have open dialogue. Some parts of the services do, but I think that's where I think that I see that there's started to be some movement to innovate and to test, because you don't have to do some of the more clunky procurement that Zahra was talking about. You can do things in small envelopes where you don't have to go out and through a big procurement process, and try smaller contractors and try smaller SMEs who are doing something a bit different, test it. So that's where we are at the moment. What happens in the light of all of the current challenges, including COVID and the forthcoming Brexit and forthcoming issues, is another factor, isn't it?
So, and if you can look that far forward, so you're part of a really exciting project as part of Greater Cambridge to bring together two different planning departments, Cambridge City Council, South Cambridgeshire, and to kind of rewrite the structure of what a planning department in the traditional sense looks like, and bring in new skills. Be good to hear your perspective on the challenges in terms of resourcing and bringing in the skills you need, and where you see your needs going, and not just next year, but perhaps in 5 years' time, about the kind of mix of expertise you think local authorities are going to need in-house.
Well, I think there's a real lack of understanding about what the future skills in planning are required. I mean, you hear a lot about the lack of planners and the difficulty in recruiting planners in the public sector, which I think there's validity to it. I mean, I think you need to split out planners who work in development management and delivery side, in the transactional side of planning, and those who are the policymakers and strategic planners, because I think there's a very distinct difference in those skill sets. But certainly, if you look at councils that have people dedicated to to data within planning departments, there aren't any. Okay, so planning has arguably the most powerful and largest data sets that are just locked up PDFs, that are essentially give a rich picture but are not used, and we know this is a big problem, so I think that the digital skills are seriously lacking, and and that is that's through no fault of its own. I note in your kind of grim sheet here talking around, we have had 8 years of cutting, and when politicians have got to make decisions about what services they cut and what areas they cut, they're not going to do the ones that have an indirect issue. They're going to go to the ones that have got a direct problem if they don't have funding. And that's just the way it is. It's like, you and I, we'd all do exactly the same in that situation. But the problem is it creates this continuous kind of hamster wheel where if you cut services, you're always operating just about keeping your head over water. So there is no room to think in 1 year, 2 years time. Planning departments are almost solely using, one single monopoly of, development management system across the UK, which is probably not fit for purpose and doesn't do what it needs to do. It's certainly not a user designed one. And, the transactional side of planning, I imagine the waste within development management is horrific in terms of people's time spent. I mean, that's not my area, but I know, I've got plenty of colleagues who find it very frustrating. And whereas actually the plan making and place making needs to be, aspirational and thinking forward, we've got all this, so the skill sets I think are we're still trying to employ the same skills that we needed in 15 years ago, and actually what we really need is to think about the things that we need now. And talking about data is critical, but we haven't even scratched the surface. We're not even aware of it. So that's a really interesting one. And I do think for me, competent people who understand complexity. You don't need planners, you need people who've got systems experience and complexity thinking, because it's planning. You can have technical planners, but a lot of planning and placemaking is about managing different conflicting interests and different conflicting priorities. And actually you don't need to be a planner to do that. You just need to have some good understanding of how systems work and complexities. Project management's another one. We don't have project managers in planning. Why not? You're running a project that's delivering a site for 15,000 houses over a period of 15 years. I mean, yes, it moved from the planning authority to being delivered, but you're still dealing with that delivery for a period of time. So you need to have people who can oversee that, who aren't bogged down in the technicalities of whether you've put back boxes on the trees or whatever the case may be. So it's an interesting one that those skills are kind of missing. And
Megan, just reflecting on your experience working in a tech startup in Berlin, right? How you see those skills potentially evolving in the future within local government, how much of Paul resonates with you coming from that background?
Well, yeah, a lot of what he said resonated. I think sort of apart from that tech question, I think in order to be innovative and to be creative, you need to have space and time. Like you just need to have a bit of time to think. And I think from the first day I opened the door to Newham, I've just been rushed off my feet. There's no time to even read the strategies which the council is producing, let alone act on them, or let alone think creatively about how to do that. That you really have to carve the time out to do that. So I think while every department, I haven't met anyone who just seems to be taking it easy, and I suppose that's kind of a surprise. I'm sure there are, as there are in any huge workplace, there are some people who are coasting, but certainly feels like in the regeneration and in the planning teams, so those people that I've spent most time with, people don't have any time just to sort of coast or even just to kick back and think creatively. So I think in terms of resourcing, if people weren't quite so busy just always reacting, and I suppose that's what public practice is trying to do, is to help us to be proactive, but it feels like it is very much a sort of reactive a sort of reactive game.
Zahra,
and in terms of sorry,
so I was just going to ask for Zahra's input on the R&D program on that side, because it's obviously something we try and build in through the 10%, where the cohort's getting together every other Friday, and it'd be good to hear your thoughts on how far that kind of building in that kind of space for thinking can help address some of the issues that people have talked about working within silos and organizations not sharing practice with each other and not having that headspace to go beyond dealing with the firefighting of everyday work.
Yeah, okay. I think the R&D program has probably been one of the most exciting aspects of doing this role, because we are working with and speaking to, even though at the moment it's virtually, we're speaking to different people from different councils, hearing about their experiences. And I think that's the thing, actually, lots of people have done what I'm trying to do, or whether it's small sites or whether it's competition, people have done this before and people have done it successfully. And it's not something that always needs to be reinvented, or it's something where it's a slight tweak can make a really big change. And so having that space to be able to speak to each other and discuss how things are done, or even troubleshoot issues we're having, and people from various walks and backgrounds coming in with their experiences and saying, well, how about this, how about that, that's been incredible. And I think one of the exciting aspects of public practice, but also being in a public sector, and I slightly came into it with a neutral expectation, but there's a background chatter of I'm doing my part 3 at the moment, but which is the Chartered Architect program in the UK, but there was this expectation that you're not going to be learning as much, or you're not going to potentially be getting as much information about architecture or the profession. And actually it's been the complete opposite. And I think the R&D program is part of that, where things like the white paper, things like recent topics coming out or big parts of planning, procurement, and actually having a huge amount of input and training and knowledge constantly coming in. I mean, I've been incredibly impressed by that in the council, where, you know, we've got planners, we've got people who know contracts back to front, and it's been a really steep learning curve. And I think the R&D program is a big part of that, but it's also about expanding the network and meeting people that I don't think I ordinarily would have met and have been able to kind of contribute to my own learning or just help me think through a problem. And I think that's incredibly valuable.
And I think that links back to what Paul was saying about skills and this question of what kind of experiences we need within local authorities. Obviously, the cohorts that public practice assembles are interdisciplinary by their very nature, people from a whole range of built environment backgrounds, and often people working between different disciplines. But also, I think we're starting to see a renewed appreciation of the importance of having a diversity of lived experience within local authorities to address the very, very real problems that citizens face. Megan, Paul, you want to talk about that side of things?
I mean, that's a really, really good point. And I think that, you know, I'll be quick, so I appreciate you haven't got much time and I've talked a lot, but you know, the local government has always been also quite a stable kind of place for people to stay. So what you get is you know, lots of people who've been in local government for a very long time. And so you don't get that movement of thought. So having people come in, you know, in my own experience of using you guys since whenever, you know, 2017 or 2018, you know, having our different, which we've got them all still there, you know, and that different experience coming in, they've come in and question things and question just simple, straightforward stuff. Why are we doing this? This is, you know, this is crazy. And actually, you know, we all do that, but actually it's, you know, it's having that constant questioning. I think having new diversity coming into local authorities is so critical, having people who have different experiences and different ways of thinking. And actually that is you know, that's something that we've not done particularly well at. I think in some areas, I think some authorities will be different to that, you know, just by their juxtaposition really geographically, you know, they'll have more diversity within them, but, you know, you're not going to get that with all authorities. But certainly it's that ability to be able to communicate differently. And I found that's another point of that is actually, you know, with planning and placemaking, it's very complex. How do you communicate that? How do you simplify that? Well, what you do is you have lots of different people who've got lots of different experience of what it means to them, and then they can talk to members and, you know, citizens on a different level, rather than being very technical or very, you know, non-understandable, which isn't the word, but never mind.
Megan, what do you think the barriers are to attracting more people to even consider going into local government as a career, and how can we encourage more people to think about it as a direction?
It's weirdly hard to get in. Seems strange, doesn't it? You wouldn't think it would be so hard, but I do feel like it's quite opaque.
Oh, I think we've lost your sound, Megan. At least I have.
Oh
dear. You're back on now.
Am I back? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think it's sort of strangely opaque. And I was just reflecting, I was thinking about tech teams in councils, and I don't know if councils do have their own tech teams, but that would be an amazing thing if councils could develop their own digital tools in-house. I know that Gov UK was sort of held up as a real exemplar of how to deliver great tools. I don't know if it's still quite the shining star that it was, but like it was definitely a few years ago, was like, you know, one of the most attractive places for ambitious developers and engineers to work. So I mean, that's kind of incredible, but I'm just reflecting on it. I haven't heard a single person in my sort of, you know, my networks anywhere that's thought about going into public sector from a digital point of view, or like for digital jobs. So I suppose that's a huge thing. Why are more architects not going in? I don't know. I think in Newham there are a couple of architects who joined actually, not through public practice, but I think there is a move towards it. But again, I think it's difficult. So I think public practice has been really great to sort of open that up and to make it less obscure, somehow making that pathway a lot easier. And also obviously the additional support, as Zahra mentioned, of the R&D days has just been like a huge benefit. But yeah, I think generally it's kind of just hard to find the jobs, and you wouldn't even know where to look almost.
And authorities say it's hard to find the people.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just going to end now because we're coming towards the end of it. We've got a question here in the chat about how do Megan and Zahra in particular, I suspect, see their future career prospects, not necessarily in the public sector, improved by this experience. Zahra?
I think one of the things that I found really exciting about this role is actually really developing soft skills. It's something that's often not really developed within practice. And actually, increasingly, we as architects are becoming less the sort of conventional master builders than we maybe were like 20, 30 years ago, and much more, I guess, agents or facilitators of change, or much more dynamic in how we work. And I think that's always been really exciting, but not really something that's discussed in within private practice. And a lot of the students that have been applying recently for the mentoring scheme, obviously with coronavirus, they've been struggling to find jobs. And one of the things that many of them are coming with actually is that they have very diverse sets of experiences. They've worked in fashion, they've worked in this, and they're looking for jobs that can kind of match that. And I think it's a bit of a shame that actually the private sector is somewhere where they're just, I don't know, going into a role and actually working rather statically on a set of drawings. And there's a real scope for quite dynamic growth in the public sector. And so I'm not sure what I'll do next, but I think I'm quite excited about not necessarily working within just a conventional office, and actually working in this role where I'm, not just drawing, or I'm not just thinking about the built environment, but actually thinking about ways that we can facilitate change within that and the skills that are necessary for that to happen, whether that's something like leadership or teamwork, or even understanding how to facilitate conversations and to negotiate. And so, I think that's been really exciting for me.
Megan?
Yeah, I think I'll just sort of echo that really. Obviously right now I've got sort of one foot in the public sector, one foot in the private sector, and I'm really enjoying that balance. I think working in an architecture practice for, on projects for local authorities, we would always just like, oh my God, why is it taking so long? Why do we never hear back? And now I've got, I can see from the other side, I'm like, oh yeah, I can see, and I totally understand why what the challenges were. So it's really sort of helped educate me as to what challenges both sides are facing. So I hope that I will be able to sort of navigate that. So from the public sector side, make briefs and create projects that practices and other disciplines can answer. But also from the architecture side, to understand the challenges the local authorities are facing and to respond to briefs in a way that is sympathetic to that. So so they're quite separate right now, but I feel like both sides are sort of helping me do a better job on the other side, if you see what I mean.
And that goes back to Paul's point about the public sector no longer really being seen as a job for life, and the private sector and the public sector not being seen as kind of two completely different worlds. Paul, just to end with, be good to sort of zoom out and get your thoughts on how perceptions of the public sector are changing. Obviously, COVID-19 in itself has drawn into relief the role of the state and the importance of local government, the importance of public services at a very real and basic level. How do you see it changing? We talked at the beginning about the kind of the descent of the idea of public service from the 50s, 60s, 70s, where it was really seen as a privilege, to a point where planners are called new councils or enemies of enterprise. How do you see it changing in the future?
Just quickly, before I do say that, I just want to agree with both Megan and Zahra that in terms of, I think the future is fluidity across. It's not a public sector is not the public sector. It hasn't been the public sector for a long time. We all know the poor engagement with the private sector that the local government has had, because it's well documented. You've got it going on right as we speak still. But essentially, the view is that the kind of setup that you have initiated with public practice, I think is one of the most healthy things I've seen happen in local government. And your example, Megan, of you still working within private practice but also working within the public sector, that is such a powerful benefit to have within your team, because I've got somebody who exactly the same who is doing that, and that brings us such insight and such movement forward as a public service as well. And also, obviously for you guys, it is really important. It makes you see what it's like. You got to remember that local government is still the gatekeeper. To deliver massive change and big influence, you have to be working within the public sector, because it still does that. So, I think it's a really important time, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity as well, despite some of the negativity. So, on your point, sorry, I got lost a little bit there, but God, sorry, can you just reiterate that point a second?
Well, we're having to close up, so it might have to be a one-line answer in any case to a very big question, but it's really about how you see the perceptions of public service of the public sector changing going forward, if we've been through a period of 10, 20, 30, 40 years of decline of the idea of public service and public planning in particular. How might that change?
I think that there's, the simple answer to that is we have to demystify everything that we do within local government to our residents and communities, so they understand what it is that we are supposed to be doing, not just doing it because we think it's in their best interest. So there's a lot of PR work. We need a PR department and a comms department in every single authority that works well to simplify stuff.
Great, thank you. Well, I think hopefully this event, public practice, this festival, is a sign that there is a wider change of the tide that's going on, and a really exciting one. If all of this hasn't put you off the idea of joining the public sector, the application window for public practice spring 2021 cohort opens in late October and closes on the 23rd of November. So check our website for more details. And really that just leaves me to say thank you so much to our panelists, to Charles and Andrea and the Creative Bureaucracy Festival organisers for hosting us, and to all of you for tuning in. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil, and apologies that I was late. Thank you all. It's lovely to see you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.